40,000 years ago, a human hand carved a needle from bone. That 4-inch tool would reshape our species more profoundly than fire, language, or the wheel. It would give birth to fashion, and fashion would give birth to civilization itself. From ancient emperors who wore the cosmos to teenagers who challenge billion-dollar corporations with thrift store finds, fashion has been humanity's most intimate technology of power. It has toppled monarchies and launched revolutions. It has defined gods and created outcasts. It has been our armor, our art, and our rebellion. This is the story of how we learned to transform ourselves, and in doing so, transformed the world. This is the entire history of fashion. In the beginning, there was the needle. Not the word, not the wheel, but the needle. A simple tool, barely 4 inches long, carved from bone by human hands 40,000 years ago. This tiny instrument would reshape our species more profoundly than fire, language, or agriculture. It would give birth to fashion, and fashion would give birth to civilization itself. Today, we take clothing for granted. We open closets filled with garments that would have seemed like magic to our ancestors. But fashion is far more than mere decoration or protection from the elements. It is the first technology of human identity, the original language of power, status, and belonging. Fashion is how we learned to be human. The story begins in the frozen tundra of what is now Russia, where archaeologists have uncovered the world's oldest sewing needles. These aren't crude awls or simple pointed sticks, but sophisticated tools with carefully drilled eyes, polished surfaces, and precisely tapered points. The craftsmanship is extraordinary. Each needle represents hours of meticulous work, shaping bone with stone tools until it became fine enough to thread with sinew or plant fibers. But why did our ancestors invest so much time and effort in creating these tools? The answer lies in survival itself. As the last ice age gripped the earth, early humans faced temperatures that could kill in minutes. Animal skins provided warmth, but only if they could be properly shaped and sewn to fit the human body. The needle made fitted clothing possible, and fitted clothing made human expansion into harsh climates possible. This wasn't just about staying warm. The needle enabled the great human migration. With well-fitted clothing, our ancestors could survive in environments that would have been death traps for naked apes. They spread across continents, adapted to diverse climates, and established the first permanent settlements. The needle, in essence, made globalization possible 40,000 years before the term was invented. Something remarkable happened as humans mastered the art of clothing construction. They began to decorate. Cave paintings from 30,000 years ago show figures wearing elaborate headdresses, patterned garments, and jewelry. These weren't survival necessities. They were the first expressions of human creativity and social organization. Archaeological evidence reveals that even our earliest ancestors understood fashion's power to communicate. Burial sites from 25,000 years ago contain bodies adorned with thousands of carefully crafted beads, shells pierced for stringing, and ornaments made from materials that had traveled hundreds of miles. This wasn't random decoration. It was a sophisticated system of visual communication. Each group developed its own aesthetic language. The Gravettian people of Europe created intricate beadwork patterns that varied from region to region like ancient designer labels. The Aurignacian culture developed distinctive ways of working leather and bone into wearable art. These weren't just clothes. They were the first brands, the first way humans said, "I belong to this group, not that one." The development of agriculture around 10,000 years ago brought the next great leap in fashion history. As humans learned to cultivate plants, they discovered that certain fibers could be twisted into thread, woven into fabric, and transformed into clothing that was lighter, more comfortable, and more versatile than animal skins. In the fertile regions of what is now Turkey and Iraq, early farmers began processing flax into linen. This wasn't a simple discovery. Creating textile from plant fibers requires a complex series of steps. The flax must be harvested at precisely the right time, retted in water for weeks, beaten to separate the fibers, combed to align them, spun into thread, and finally woven into cloth. Each step required specialized knowledge and tools. The time and skill required to create even a simple linen garment made textiles incredibly valuable. A single tunic might represent months of work by multiple specialists. This scarcity gave birth to fashion's first great truth. Clothing is power. Those who could afford fine textiles displayed their wealth, status, and connections to skilled craftspeople. As textile production became more sophisticated, so did the symbolic language of clothing. Different weaving patterns began to carry specific meanings. Certain colors, achievable only through expensive dyes, became associated with particular social classes or religious roles. The chevron pattern, found in textiles from cultures as diverse as ancient Peru and Bronze Age Europe, may have been one of humanity's first universal symbols. Color held particular significance. Red, derived from expensive cochineal insects or rare mineral deposits, became associated with power and divinity across cultures. Blue, requiring the complex processing of indigo plants, signified wisdom and spiritual authority. White, paradoxically one of the most difficult colors to achieve and maintain, represented purity and high social status. The process of creating these colors was often closely guarded. Dye recipes were trade secrets, passed down through generations. Tyrian purple, extracted from thousands of murex shells, was so expensive that it literally cost more than gold. Laws were enacted to restrict who could wear certain colors. The first fashion police, if you will. As humans transitioned from nomadic hunters to settled farmers, clothing evolved from purely practical gear to complex social signaling. The first permanent settlements created new needs, clothing that could indicate profession, family connections, and social rank at a glance. In these early communities, what you wore literally determined how others treated you. Craftspeople developed distinctive garments that advertised their skills. Religious leaders adopted special robes that set them apart from common people. Political leaders began wearing symbols of authority that could be recognized across language barriers. The standardization of clothing styles within communities created the first fashion rules. Certain garments became associated with specific roles: the blacksmith's leather apron, the priest's ceremonial robes, the warrior's distinctive armor. Breaking these rules, wearing clothing above your station, often carried severe penalties. The development of specialized tools revolutionized textile production. The spinning wheel, invented around 8,000 years ago, dramatically increased the speed at which fibers could be converted to thread. The ground loom allowed for the creation of larger, more complex textiles. Each innovation made clothing more accessible while simultaneously enabling greater artistic expression. Regional variations in tools and techniques created distinct aesthetic traditions. The backstrap loom of the Americas produced textiles with characteristics completely different from the horizontal looms of Europe and Asia. These technological differences meant that fashion developed along unique paths in different parts of the world, creating diversity that would influence global style for millennia. Trade routes began to carry not just finished textiles, but also the knowledge of how to create them. The spread of silk-making techniques from China, the transmission of cotton cultivation from India, and the movement of wool processing methods across Europe created a global network of fashion innovation thousands of years before the modern fashion industry. One of the most significant developments in early fashion was the creation of gender-specific clothing. While the earliest garments were largely unisex, simple coverings that served practical needs, the development of complex societies brought increasingly elaborate distinctions between male and female dress. These distinctions weren't arbitrary. They reflected and reinforced social structures, economic relationships, and cultural values. Women's clothing often emphasized fertility and domestic skills, while men's garments highlighted physical strength and martial prowess. The cut, color, and decoration of clothing became a visual language that communicated gender roles as clearly as spoken words. Interestingly, these early gender distinctions varied dramatically across cultures. What was considered masculine in one society might be feminine in another. The ancient Egyptians, for instance, developed elaborate eye makeup and jewelry traditions for men that would seem feminine to many modern observers. This cultural variation in fashion norms would become a recurring theme throughout history. Religion played a crucial role in fashion's early development. Sacred garments weren't just clothing. They were believed to possess supernatural powers. The materials, colors, and construction methods of religious dress were often specified in minute detail, creating some of history's first fashion standards. Religious festivals and ceremonies drove innovation in textile arts. Special garments were created for specific rituals, often requiring years of preparation. These ceremonial clothes pushed the boundaries of what was technically possible, incorporating precious materials, complex construction techniques, and symbolic elements that told religious stories through visual means. The influence of religious fashion extended far beyond the sacred realm. Wealthy individuals began commissioning garments that mimicked religious styles, leading to the first fashion controversies about appropriation and proper respect for sacred symbols. These debates would echo through fashion history, raising questions about the boundaries between inspiration and sacrilege. As communities grew into cities and cities into civilizations, trade networks began carrying fashion influences across vast distances. The first global fashion system emerged not through mass media or internet, but through the slow, dangerous journeys of merchants carrying precious textiles across continents. These early fashion networks were remarkably sophisticated. Silk from China reached Europe through the famous Silk Road, but also through sea routes that connected Asian producers with African and European markets. Cotton textiles from India influenced fashion choices in Southeast Asia, the Middle East, and eventually Europe. American civilizations developed their own trade networks, spreading distinctive textile traditions across the Western Hemisphere. The movement of textiles carried more than just materials. It transmitted ideas, techniques, and aesthetic preferences. A weaving pattern developed in one region might appear in modified form thousands of miles away, adapted to local materials and cultural preferences. This early globalization of fashion created the first truly international style influences. The high value of textiles in ancient societies created the first fashion economy. Skilled weavers, dyers, and seamstresses commanded high prices for their work. Rare materials like silk, fine wool, and exotic dyes became valuable commodities that drove exploration and trade. This economic importance of fashion had profound social consequences. Textile production provided employment for large numbers of people, particularly women. It created incentives for technological innovation and artistic development. It funded exploration and trade missions that expanded human knowledge of the world. The wealth generated by fashion also created the first fashion cities, places where skilled artisans concentrated to produce luxury goods for elite markets. These centers of textile production became important cultural and economic hubs, influencing politics, religion, and society in ways that extended far beyond clothing. As we look back at these earliest chapters of fashion history, we see the establishment of principles that continue to shape how we dress today. The idea that clothing communicates identity, the association of certain materials and colors with status, the role of fashion in defining group membership. All of these concepts emerged in humanity's first experiments with clothing. The needle that started this revolution was more than a tool. It was the key that unlocked human potential. It enabled our ancestors to survive in harsh climates, express their creativity, organize their societies, and eventually build the civilizations that would produce the Renaissance, the Industrial Revolution, and the modern fashion industry. When we put on clothing each morning, we're participating in a ritual that stretches back 40,000 years. We're making choices about identity, status, and belonging that our ancestors would recognize, even if they couldn't imagine the materials and technologies we use today. Fashion didn't just make us human, it made us civilized. The story of fashion is ultimately the story of human ambition, creativity, and the endless desire to transform the ordinary into the extraordinary. From the first bone needle to the latest haute couture creation, fashion has been the thread that weaves together our individual stories into the grand tapestry of human civilization. 5,000 years ago, something extraordinary happened to human civilization. Villages became cities, cities became kingdoms, and kingdoms became empires. And with this transformation came fashion's golden age, literally. For the first time in human history, vast resources were concentrated in the hands of divine rulers, and they used these resources to create clothing that was more than mere decoration. They created wearable manifestations of power itself. Welcome to the world of ancient empires, where fashion became the language of gods, where clothing could determine life or death, and where the geometry of a garment could encode the mysteries of the universe. This is the story of how fashion learned to rule the world. In 1922, when Howard Carter first peered into the tomb of Tutankhamun, he famously whispered, "I see wonderful things." Among those wonderful things were not just golden treasures, but textiles so perfectly preserved that we can still read the fashion language of divine kingship after 3,300 years. The boy pharaoh was buried with over 100 garments, each one a masterpiece of textile art and religious symbolism. Egyptian royal fashion wasn't just about looking impressive, it was about becoming divine. The pharaoh's crown wasn't merely a hat, it was a cosmic antenna that connected the earthly ruler to the gods. The false beard, strapped to the chin even of female pharaohs like Hatshepsut, transformed the wearer into a living embodiment of divine masculinity. The uraeus serpent on the forehead wasn't decoration. It was a weapon that could strike down enemies with divine fire. Every element of pharaonic dress had meaning. The color blue, achieved through expensive lapis lazuli, represented the heavens and eternal life. Gold, the flesh of the gods, covered everything from sandals to jewelry. The pleated linen garments weren't just elegant. Their mathematical precision in folding reflected the cosmic order that the pharaoh was sworn to maintain. This divine fashion system was so powerful that it continued even after death. The elaborate burial garments found in royal tombs weren't just grave goods. They were the clothes needed for the afterlife journey. The pharaoh would need to dress appropriately to meet the gods, and that meant being buried with a complete divine wardrobe. While Egypt was perfecting divine fashion, Mesopotamia was inventing luxury. In the great cities of Babylon, Ur, and Nineveh, fashion became a tool of political power and economic display. The Code of Hammurabi, one of history's first legal documents, included detailed regulations about clothing, what colors different classes could wear, how garments should be constructed, and what penalties awaited those who dressed above their station. Mesopotamian fashion was built on a foundation of technological innovation. These civilizations developed advanced weaving techniques, sophisticated dye processes, and the first fashion industry that could produce luxury goods at scale. The hanging gardens of Babylon were matched by hanging textiles, enormous tapestries that decorated palace walls with scenes of royal triumph and divine favor. The Mesopotamians also perfected the art of fashion diplomacy. When ambassadors arrived from distant lands, their clothing was carefully scrutinized for political messages. Gift exchanges between rulers often centered on textiles, silk from China, wool from Armenia, linen from Egypt. These early fashion exchanges were as important as military alliances in maintaining the balance of power. The ancient Greeks revolutionized fashion by applying mathematical principles to clothing design. Greek garments weren't just beautiful, they were geometrically perfect. The Doric chiton, the Ionic peplos, the himation. Each garment was based on precise mathematical relationships that the Greeks believed reflected the underlying order of the universe. Greek fashion was democratic, in a way that previous civilizations' clothing had never been. While quality of materials might vary, the basic principles of Greek dress were available to all citizens. This created a unified aesthetic that reinforced Greek cultural identity while allowing for individual expression within established parameters. The Greeks elevated draping to an art form. Unlike the tailored garments of other civilizations, Greek clothing was created through the skillful manipulation of rectangular pieces of cloth. This required no cutting, no sewing of complex seams, just an understanding of how fabric behaves when folded, pinned, and draped around the human form. Perhaps most revolutionary was the Greek attitude toward the body itself. Greek fashion celebrated the human form rather than hiding it. The gymnasium culture, where young men trained naked, created an aesthetic that valued physical perfection. This influence extended to clothing. Greek garments were designed to reveal as much as they concealed, creating a fashion philosophy that would influence Western dress for millennia. The Romans took Greek fashion principles and weaponized them for empire. Roman clothing wasn't just about looking good, it was about maintaining the largest political system the world had ever seen. The toga, that most Roman of garments, wasn't just national dress. It was a tool of social control so effective that it lasted for centuries. Roman fashion was a complex hierarchy encoded in cloth. The toga praetexta, with its purple border, could only be worn by magistrates and freeborn children. The toga picta, completely purple and gold, was reserved for triumphant generals and eventually emperors. The toga candida, bleached brilliant white, was worn by political candidates, giving us the word candidate itself. Roman women's fashion was equally regulated but more varied. The stola, the respectable matron's dress, marked its wearer as a married woman of good standing. The elaborately decorated silk garments imported from China became so popular that they threatened to drain the Roman treasury, leading to sumptuary laws that restricted their use. The Roman Empire created the first truly global fashion system. Roman merchants established trade routes that connected Britain to India, Spain to China. Roman fashion influenced and was influenced by styles from across the known world. A Roman aristocrat's wardrobe might include wool from Britain, silk from China, purple dye from Lebanon, and gold thread from Nubia. While Mediterranean civilizations were developing their fashion systems, China was perfecting the most revolutionary textile technology in human history. Silk production. For over 2,000 years, China maintained a monopoly on silk manufacturing, making it the basis of the world's most important trade network. Chinese fashion during the Han Dynasty, 206 BC to 220 CE, achieved a level of sophistication that wouldn't be matched in Europe for centuries. Silk garments were decorated with intricate embroidery, painted designs, and complex weaving patterns that told stories from Chinese mythology and history. The emperor's dragon robes weren't just clothing, they were wearable museums of Chinese culture. The Chinese also developed fashion's first true global brand. Chinese silk was so desired that it literally gave its name to the Silk Road, the network of trade routes that connected East and West. Roman aristocrats bankrupted themselves buying Chinese silk, while Chinese nobles prized glass and gold from the Mediterranean. India contributed its own innovations to the ancient fashion world. Indian cotton textiles were so fine that Romans called them woven air. Indian dyers developed techniques that produced colors so vibrant and permanent that they seemed magical to foreign observers. The paisley pattern, derived from ancient Indian designs, would eventually become one of the world's most recognizable motifs. In the Americas, isolated from Old World fashion influences, indigenous civilizations developed their own extraordinary approaches to clothing. The Maya perfected the art of featherwork, creating garments that transformed their wearers into living representations of birds and celestial beings. Quetzal feathers, more valuable than gold, were reserved for the highest nobility. Mayan fashion was deeply connected to their understanding of astronomy and mathematics. The patterns on noble garments often corresponded to astronomical events, while the colors and materials used were chosen to align with religious calendars. Clothing wasn't just decoration, it was a form of wearable calendar that kept track of cosmic time. The Aztecs elevated featherwork to even greater heights, creating garments that were marvels of engineering as well as art. Their feathered shields and cloaks were so magnificent that Spanish conquistadors sent them back to Europe as gifts for royalty. The Inca, meanwhile, developed textile techniques that produced cloth so fine it was used as currency throughout their empire. African civilizations developed their own sophisticated fashion systems, often based on materials and techniques unknown elsewhere. The Kingdom of Kush, in what is now Sudan, was famous for its use of gold and ivory in clothing decoration. Nubian royal garments combined Egyptian influences with distinctly African aesthetic principles. West African kingdoms developed advanced cotton cultivation and textile production centuries before these techniques reached Europe. The intricate patterns woven into kente cloth by Ghanaian artisans encoded complex cultural information, while the mud cloth of Mali used locally available materials to create striking geometric designs. Perhaps most remarkably, African fashion systems often emphasized transformation and change rather than fixed hierarchies. Many African cultures developed ceremonial garments that completely altered the wearer's appearance, creating new identities for religious or political purposes. These transformative aspects of African fashion would later influence styles throughout the African diaspora. The fashion achievements of ancient empires were made possible by revolutionary advances in textile technology. The invention of the vertical loom allowed for the production of longer, more complex fabrics. New spinning techniques created finer threads, while improved dye processes produced colors that were both more vibrant and more permanent. Each empire developed its own technological specialties. The Chinese perfected silk reeling and weaving. The Romans developed industrial-scale wool processing. The Egyptians mastered linen production and gold thread manufacturing. The Indians created the finest cotton textiles in the world. These technological advantages often determined the balance of power in ancient fashion trade. The knowledge of these techniques was carefully guarded. Skilled artisans were highly valued and often prohibited from leaving their home countries. Industrial espionage was common, as empires tried to steal each other's textile secrets. The theft of silk-making techniques from China was considered one of the greatest intelligence coups of the ancient world. In the ancient world, fashion became a crucial tool of international diplomacy. Rulers communicated their power, wealth, and cultural sophistication through their clothing choices. A pharaoh's decision to wear certain colors when meeting foreign ambassadors sent messages that were read and interpreted across the known world. Textile gifts were central to diplomatic relations. The Chinese emperor's gift of silk to foreign rulers was both a display of generosity and a demonstration of China's technological superiority. Roman togas given to allied kings were symbols of friendship and inclusion in the Roman sphere of influence. These diplomatic fashion exchanges created the first truly international styles. Garments that originated in one empire would be adapted and modified as they spread to others. The result was a constant flow of fashion innovation that accelerated cultural exchange and technological development. As the great empires of the ancient world fell, so too did their sophisticated fashion systems. The collapse of the Roman Empire disrupted trade networks that had supplied luxury textiles for centuries. The fall of the Han Dynasty in China ended the golden age of silk production. The conquest of the Americas destroyed indigenous textile traditions that had developed over millennia. Yet the influence of ancient empire fashion didn't disappear. The techniques, materials, and aesthetic principles developed in the ancient world would be rediscovered and adapted by later civilizations. The mathematical principles of Greek dress would influence Renaissance fashion. Roman concepts of status dressing would shape medieval and modern hierarchies. Chinese silk would remain the ultimate luxury fabric for centuries to come. As we look back at the fashion achievements of ancient empires, we see the establishment of principles that continue to shape how we think about clothing today. The idea that fashion can express political power, the association of certain materials with luxury and status, the use of clothing as diplomatic communication. All of these concepts were perfected in the ancient world. The golden age of ancient fashion teaches us that clothing has always been more than mere covering or decoration. In the hands of skilled artisans and powerful rulers, fashion became a tool for shaping society, expressing cultural values, and maintaining political control. The empires may have fallen, but their fashion legacy lives on in every garment we wear and every style choice we make. The story of ancient empire fashion is ultimately a story of human ambition and creativity, channeled through cloth and thread. From the divine robes of Egyptian pharaohs to the geometric perfection of Greek garments, from the regulatory complexity of Roman togas to the transcendent beauty of Chinese silk, ancient fashion created a visual language that still speaks to us across millennia. The year is 1204, and the greatest city in the Christian world is about to fall. Constantinople, the jewel of the Byzantine Empire, stands besieged not by Muslim armies, but by fellow Christians on the Fourth Crusade. When the city's walls are finally breached, the Crusaders pour through the streets in a frenzy of looting. They strip the churches of their golden chalices and sacred relics, but they also raid the imperial palace for something equally precious: silk. Bolts of the finest Byzantine silk, woven with threads of gold and silver, embroidered with pearls and precious stones, are bundled up and shipped back to Venice, Paris, and London. In that moment of conquest and chaos, the medieval world's most sophisticated fashion system begins its transformation. The medieval period, spanning roughly from the 5th to the 15th centuries, represents one of the most dynamic and revolutionary eras in fashion history. This was the age when fashion truly became global, when a single garment might contain silk from China, spices from India, gold from Africa, and craftsmanship from Europe. The medieval world created the first truly international fashion system, one built on trade routes that stretched from the Atlantic to the Pacific, from the Arctic to the Sahara. As the Western Roman Empire crumbled in the 5th century, its eastern counterpart, the Byzantine Empire, preserved and transformed the classical tradition of imperial fashion. Byzantine dress was not merely a continuation of Roman style, but a revolutionary synthesis that combined classical Roman dignity with Eastern opulence and Christian symbolism. The Byzantine court became the fashion capital of the medieval world, setting standards that would influence style from Baghdad to London. The Emperor Justinian and his wife, Theodora, elevated Byzantine fashion to unprecedented heights in the 6th century. Theodora, a former actress who had risen from humble origins to become empress, understood the power of fashion as never before. She commissioned garments that were marvels of textile engineering, incorporating silk threads so fine they seemed to glow with inner light, embroidery so detailed it required years to complete, and precious stones arranged in patterns that told stories of imperial victory and divine favor. Byzantine silk production was the foundation of the empire's wealth and fashion supremacy. The closely guarded secret of silk manufacturing, supposedly stolen from China by monks who smuggled silkworm eggs in their hollow walking sticks, gave Byzantium a monopoly that lasted for centuries. The imperial silk workshops of Constantinople produced textiles that were literally worth their weight in gold. Fabrics so magnificent that they were used as diplomatic gifts capable of securing military alliances and political treaties. The Byzantine dress code was extraordinarily complex, with different colors, patterns, and materials reserved for specific ranks within the imperial hierarchy. Purple, the most expensive dye in the ancient world, was reserved for the emperor alone. The exact shade of purple, the quality of the silk, and the specific patterns woven into the fabric all communicated precise information about the wearer's position in the Byzantine social system. This wasn't simply fashion. It was a visual language that maintained political stability across an empire that spanned 3 continents. While Byzantium preserved classical traditions, the rapidly expanding Islamic world was creating entirely new approaches to fashion and textile production. The Islamic conquests of the 7th and 8th centuries brought together diverse cultural traditions from Spain to Central Asia, creating a cosmopolitan fashion culture that valued both luxury and innovation. Islamic fashion, during the medieval period, was characterized by its technical sophistication and artistic refinement. Muslim artisans developed advanced techniques for working with silk, creating textiles that combined geometric patterns with flowing calligraphy in ways that seemed to make the fabric itself speak. The prohibition against depicting human figures in religious contexts led to the development of abstract patterns that were both mathematically precise and aesthetically stunning. The great Islamic cities, Baghdad, Cairo, Cordoba, and Damascus, became centers of textile innovation. Each city developed its own specialties. Damascus became famous for its silk damasks, fabrics so fine and lustrous that they gave their name to an entire category of textiles. Cairo dominated the trade in luxury goods from the Indian Ocean, while Cordoba became the center of leather working and textile production in Islamic Spain. Baghdad, the capital of the Abbasid Caliphate, became the greatest commercial center in the world, where merchants from China, India, Africa, and Europe gathered to exchange not just goods, but ideas about fashion and style. The Islamic world also revolutionized the use of color in fashion. Muslim dyers developed techniques for creating colors that were both brilliant and permanent, using materials gathered from across the known world. The deep blue of indigo from India, the brilliant red of kermes from the Mediterranean, and the golden yellow of saffron from Persia created a palette that was both rich and sophisticated. These colors were not merely decorative, but carried symbolic meaning, with different shades associated with different social classes, religious functions, and regional identities. Islamic fashion was also notable for its emphasis on cleanliness and hygiene. The Islamic requirement for ritual purity led to the development of clothing that was both beautiful and practical, with careful attention to fabrics that could be easily cleaned and maintained. This practical approach to fashion, combined with the Islamic emphasis on modesty, created clothing styles that were both elegant and functional. The Crusades, those great medieval wars between Christianity and Islam, are often portrayed as purely military and religious conflicts. But they were also fashion exchanges on an unprecedented scale. Every crusade brought thousands of Europeans into contact with the sophisticated fashion cultures of the Byzantine Empire and the Islamic world. The returning crusaders didn't just bring back religious relics and military glory. They brought back new ideas about clothing, new techniques for textile production, and new standards of luxury. The influence of Eastern fashion on European dress was immediate and profound. Crusaders returning from the Holy Land brought with them a taste for silk, for complex embroidery, for rich colors that had been unknown, in the darker, more austere fashion traditions of medieval Europe. The simple woolen garments that had characterized early medieval European dress began to be supplemented with silk linings, embroidered decorations, and precious metal accessories that reflected Eastern influence. The Crusader states themselves became laboratories for fashion fusion. In the kingdoms of Jerusalem, Antioch, and Edessa, European knights married into local noble families, creating a unique cultural synthesis that was reflected in their clothing. These hybrid styles combined the martial traditions of European knighthood with the luxury and sophistication of Eastern court dress, creating new forms of fashion that would influence style throughout the medieval world. The military orders, the Knights Templar, the Knights Hospitaller, and the Teutonic Knights, developed their own distinctive fashion traditions that combined religious symbolism with military functionality. The simple white mantle of the Templars, marked with a red cross, became one of the most recognizable garments in the medieval world. These monastic military orders created a new model of fashion that emphasized symbolic meaning over mere decoration, a model that would influence religious and military dress for centuries to come. The Silk Road, that legendary network of trade routes connecting East and West, was fashion's first global highway. Along these routes, which stretched from the Mediterranean to the Pacific, traveled not just silk and spices, but ideas about style, techniques for textile production, and cultural concepts of beauty and elegance. The Silk Road made possible the first truly international fashion system, one in which a single garment might incorporate materials and techniques from a dozen different cultures. The merchants who traveled these routes were the first international fashion dealers. They didn't just transport goods, they carried information about what was fashionable in different parts of the world, what techniques were being developed in distant workshops, and what styles were being adopted by rulers and nobles in far-off lands. A merchant traveling from Venice to Beijing would observe and remember the fashion preferences of every court he visited, adapting his cargo and his approach to local tastes and preferences. The cities along the Silk Road became cosmopolitan fashion centers where East met West. Samarkand, Kashgar, and Bukhara were not just trading posts, but cultural laboratories where different fashion traditions merged and evolved. In these cities, Chinese silk might be cut and sewn according to Persian patterns, decorated with Indian embroidery, and finished with Byzantine techniques. The result was a truly international style that reflected the global nature of medieval trade. The Silk Road also facilitated the spread of textile technologies. The secret of silk production, jealously guarded by China for centuries, gradually spread westward along the trade routes. Similarly, Islamic techniques for dyeing and pattern making moved eastward, while European innovations in wool processing and leather working traveled in both directions. This technological exchange accelerated the development of textile production throughout the medieval world. Medieval Europe began the period with a relatively simple and austere fashion tradition, but by the end of the era, it had developed one of the most sophisticated and hierarchical fashion systems in the world. This transformation was driven by several factors: the revival of trade, the growth of cities, the rise of a wealthy merchant class, and the increasing contact with the more sophisticated fashion cultures of the East. The feudal system of medieval Europe created a fashion hierarchy that was both rigid and complex. At the top were the kings and emperors, whose clothing was designed to reflect their divine authority and political power. Below them were the various ranks of nobility, each with their own specific dress codes and restrictions. The emerging merchant class created new categories of fashion that challenged traditional hierarchies, while the peasantry remained largely excluded from fashionable dress. The development of European fashion was closely tied to the growth of cities and the revival of trade. Cities like Venice, Genoa, and Bruges became centers of fashion innovation, where wealthy merchants competed with traditional nobility in displays of sartorial magnificence. The guilds that controlled textile production in these cities developed increasingly sophisticated techniques for working with silk, wool, and other materials, creating garments that rivaled those produced in the East. The rise of courtly culture in medieval Europe also drove fashion innovation. The court of Eleanor of Aquitaine in the 12th century, the court of Frederick II in Sicily, and the court of the French kings in Paris all became centers of fashion development. These courts created new standards of elegance and sophistication that spread throughout Europe, influencing everything from the cut of garments to the choice of colors and decorations. Color in medieval fashion was not merely decorative, but a powerful indicator of social status, wealth, and political allegiance. The medieval world developed elaborate color codes that were enforced by law and custom, creating a visual language that could be read by anyone familiar with the system. The most exclusive colors, purple, crimson, and cloth of gold, were reserved for royalty and the highest nobility, while lesser colors were assigned to lower social ranks. The production of luxury colors was a complex and expensive process that required rare materials and specialized knowledge. Purple, the most prestigious color, was produced from murex shells gathered from the Mediterranean, a process so costly and time-consuming that purple fabric was literally worth more than gold. Crimson was produced from kermes insects, while the deepest blues required indigo from India. These colors were not just expensive, but were often legally restricted, with sumptuary laws specifying exactly who could wear what colors. The medieval world also developed sophisticated techniques for color-fast dyeing, ensuring that these expensive colors would not fade or run when exposed to light or moisture. The guild system that controlled textile production jealously guarded the secrets of color production, with master dyers serving long apprenticeships to learn the complex processes required to create perfect colors. Religion played a crucial role in medieval fashion, influencing everything from the choice of materials to the cut of garments. The Christian Church developed elaborate vestments that were among the most sophisticated textiles of the medieval world, while Islamic and Jewish traditions created their own distinctive approaches to religious dress. Christian ecclesiastical fashion was characterized by its use of the finest materials and most skilled craftsmanship. The vestments worn by bishops and abbots were often more luxurious than the clothing of secular nobles, incorporating silk, gold thread, and precious stones in patterns that told religious stories and conveyed theological concepts. The papal tiara, episcopal rings, and ceremonial robes were not just religious symbols, but masterpieces of medieval fashion. The monastic orders created their own fashion traditions that emphasized simplicity and humility while still maintaining high standards of craftsmanship. The Benedictines, Cistercians, and Franciscans each developed distinctive habits that reflected their religious values and practices. These religious garments influenced secular fashion, with many elements of monastic dress being adopted by lay people seeking to express their piety. The medieval period also saw the development of distinctive Jewish and Islamic dress traditions that were often mandated by law. The pointed hat required of Jews in many European cities, the yellow badge that marked Jewish identity, and the distinctive turbans worn by Muslim merchants all reflected the complex relationship between religion and fashion in the medieval world. Medieval women's fashion was characterized by both constraint and creativity, with clothing that was designed to reflect and reinforce social hierarchies while still allowing for individual expression and artistic innovation. The ideal of feminine beauty in the medieval world emphasized modesty, purity, and social status, creating fashion traditions that were both restrictive and remarkably sophisticated. The development of women's fashion was closely tied to the rise of courtly culture and the cult of courtly love. The elaborate headdresses, flowing gowns, and decorative accessories that characterized medieval women's fashion were not just clothing, but symbols of cultural refinement and social status. The houppelande, the cote-hardie, and the wimple were not merely garments, but statements about the wearer's position in society and her relationship to the dominant cultural values of her time. Medieval women's fashion also reflected the influence of religious values, with clothing that emphasized modesty and spiritual purity. The long sleeves, high necklines, and covered heads that characterized medieval women's dress were not just fashion choices, but expressions of religious devotion and social respectability. The medieval period saw the development of tailoring as a skilled craft, with the creation of fitted garments that followed the contours of the human body. This was a revolutionary development that transformed fashion from the draped clothing of the ancient world to the fitted garments that would characterize European dress for centuries to come. The rise of tailoring was closely tied to the development of new tools and techniques for cutting and sewing fabric. The invention of the button, the development of more sophisticated patterns, and the creation of new seaming techniques all contributed to the ability to create garments that were both fitted and flattering. The guilds that controlled tailoring jealously guarded these techniques, with master tailors serving long apprenticeships to learn the complex skills required to create perfect fitting. The development of tailoring also created new possibilities for fashion innovation, with garments that could be customized to fit individual bodies and personal tastes. This led to the creation of more diverse and individualized fashion styles, breaking away from the more standardized clothing of earlier periods. The medieval period established many of the fundamental principles that would govern fashion for centuries to come. The association of certain colors and materials with social status, the development of sophisticated tailoring techniques, the creation of international trade networks for luxury goods, and the establishment of fashion as a form of cultural expression all emerged during this remarkable era. The medieval world created the first truly global fashion system, one that connected diverse cultures and civilizations through shared appreciation for beautiful clothing and sophisticated textile production. The trade routes that carried silk from China to Europe, the techniques that were developed for creating perfect colors, and the cultural exchanges that occurred during the Crusades all contributed to a fashion revolution that would shape the development of style for centuries to come. As we look back at the medieval period, we see not just a time of knights and castles, but an era of extraordinary fashion innovation and cultural exchange. The medieval world taught us that fashion is not just about clothing, but about identity, status, and the human desire to create beauty in the world. From the silk workshops of Constantinople to the tailoring guilds of Paris, from the spice markets of Baghdad to the courts of Eleanor of Aquitaine, the medieval world created a fashion legacy that continues to influence how we dress and how we think about clothing today. In the summer of 1520, two of Europe's most powerful monarchs met on a field outside Calais in what would become known as the Field of the Cloth of Gold. Henry VIII of England and Francis I of France had gathered not for war, but for diplomacy, and they understood that their clothing would speak louder than their words. Henry arrived wearing a doublet of cloth of gold, so heavy with precious stones that it could barely be lifted. Francis responded with a coat that incorporated actual gold thread, woven so densely that it created a surface like molten metal. For 18 days, these two kings competed in displays of sartorial magnificence that bankrupted their treasuries and established new standards of royal fashion that would influence European court dress for centuries. This moment captures the essence of fashion during the Renaissance and Baroque periods, an era when clothing became the primary language of power, when the expansion of European influence across the globe brought exotic materials and techniques to European workshops, and when the human body was reshaped through clothing to reflect new ideas about beauty, power, and social order. From roughly 1400 to 1750, fashion underwent a transformation as dramatic as the artistic and intellectual revolution that defined these centuries. The Renaissance brought a fundamental shift in how Europeans understood the relationship between clothing and identity. Medieval fashion had emphasized the spiritual and the hierarchical, with clothing that reflected religious values and feudal social structures. Renaissance fashion, by contrast, embraced the individual and the worldly, creating garments that celebrated human beauty, personal wealth, and cultural sophistication. The Italian city-states led this fashion revolution. Venice, Florence, and Milan became centers of textile innovation and luxury production that rivaled the great workshops of the East. The Medici Bank's international network made Florence the financial capital of Europe, and Florentine fashion reflected this cosmopolitan wealth. The sumptuous fabrics, intricate embroidery, and sophisticated tailoring that characterized Italian Renaissance dress established new standards of elegance that would spread throughout Europe. Renaissance fashion was deeply influenced by the revival of classical learning and the rediscovery of ancient Greek and Roman texts. Humanist scholars didn't just study classical literature. They studied classical approaches to the human body, beauty, and proportion. This intellectual movement influenced fashion design, leading to garments that emphasized natural body shapes rather than concealing them, and that incorporated mathematical principles of proportion and harmony. The development of portraiture during the Renaissance also transformed fashion. For the first time since antiquity, wealthy Europeans were commissioning painted portraits that would preserve their appearance for posterity. This created new pressures for fashion innovation, as nobles and merchants sought clothing that would look impressive in paint and that would communicate their status and sophistication to future generations. The portraits of Titian, Holbein, and Van Dyck became fashion magazines for the elite, spreading new styles and establishing new standards of elegance. The Renaissance also saw the emergence of fashion as a form of artistic expression. Master tailors and seamstresses began to be recognized as artists rather than mere craftspeople, and their work was valued not just for its functionality, but for its beauty and innovation. The collaboration between fashion designers and painters, sculptors and architects created new possibilities for clothing design that had never existed before. Perhaps no single garment better captures the transformation of fashion during this period than the corset. First appearing in the courts of Renaissance Europe, the corset represented a radical departure from medieval approaches to women's clothing. Where medieval women's dress had been relatively loose and flowing, the corset created a rigid, geometric silhouette that emphasized the artificial over the natural. The corset was not merely a garment, but a technology for reshaping the human body. Made from layers of linen or silk reinforced with whalebone, wood, or steel, the corset could compress the waist to extraordinary proportions while pushing the bust upward and outward. This wasn't just about fashion. It was about creating a new ideal of feminine beauty that emphasized control, discipline, and the ability to transform nature through human artifice. The adoption of the corset reflected broader cultural changes during the Renaissance and Baroque periods. The emphasis on geometric perfection, the celebration of human technical achievement, and the desire to demonstrate control over the natural world were all embodied in this single garment. The corset transformed women's bodies into living sculptures, creating silhouettes that were both artificial and idealized. The corset also created new possibilities for fashion design. The rigid torso provided a foundation for elaborate decorative treatments, from intricate embroidery to precious stone encrustation. The contrast between the compressed waist and the flowing skirts created dramatic visual effects that emphasized the wearer's wealth and status. The corset became the foundation of women's fashion for over 3 centuries, influencing everything from walking styles to interior design. The Renaissance and Baroque periods saw the emergence of court culture as the primary driver of fashion innovation. The courts of Europe became stages for elaborate performances of power, where clothing served as costumes in an endless drama of political positioning and social competition. The court of Louis XIV at Versailles represented the pinnacle of this development, creating a fashion system so elaborate and expensive that it helped bankrupt the French monarchy. Louis XIV understood fashion as a tool of political control better than any ruler before him. He established elaborate dress codes that required courtiers to spend enormous sums on clothing, ensuring that they remained financially dependent on royal favor. The Sun King's own wardrobe was legendary. He owned over 400 suits, each more elaborate than the last, and he changed clothes multiple times per day in elaborate ceremonies that turned dressing into a form of religious ritual. The Versailles court created fashion innovations that would influence European dress for centuries. The juste au corps, a long coat that became the foundation of men's formal wear, was developed at Versailles. The mantua, a women's gown that allowed for elaborate decorative treatment, was first worn by French court ladies. The high heels that became synonymous with aristocratic status were popularized by Louis XIV, who wore them to add to his relatively modest height. The influence of court fashion extended far beyond France. The Spanish court developed its own distinctive style, characterized by rigid silhouettes and somber colors that reflected the austere Catholicism of the Spanish monarchy. The English court, particularly under the Stuarts, embraced a more relaxed approach to fashion that emphasized comfort and practicality alongside elegance. The German and Italian courts each developed their own variations on European court dress, creating a rich tapestry of regional styles within the broader European fashion system. The age of exploration and the establishment of European colonies around the world transformed fashion by making available an unprecedented variety of materials and techniques. Spanish conquistadors brought back not just gold and silver from the Americas, but also new dyes, new fibers, and new approaches to textile decoration. Dutch merchants established trade networks that brought Asian silks, Indian cottons, and Indonesian spices to European markets. Portuguese traders connected Europe with African ivory, exotic feathers, and rare aromatics. The impact of colonial trade on European fashion cannot be overstated. American silver made possible the creation of elaborate metallic threads that transformed European textile production. Cochineal from Mexico produced the most brilliant red dyes ever seen in Europe, leading to the development of new dyeing techniques and new standards of color intensity. Brazilian diamonds and Colombian emeralds provided new possibilities for jewelry design that had never existed before. The colonial period also saw the first truly global fashion influences. Indian cotton textiles, particularly the colorful printed fabrics known as chintz, became so popular in Europe that they threatened traditional wool and linen production. The European response was to develop new techniques for printing and dyeing that could compete with Indian imports, leading to innovations in textile production that would eventually fuel the Industrial Revolution. The influence flowed in both directions. European colonists in the Americas adapted local materials and techniques to create new forms of dress that reflected their colonial status. The mixing of European, African, and indigenous American influences created entirely new fashion traditions that would eventually influence global style. The plantation system in the Americas created new forms of work clothing that emphasized durability and functionality over decoration, while the wealth generated by colonial exploitation funded ever more elaborate displays of European court fashion. The Protestant Reformation and the Catholic Counter-Reformation had profound effects on fashion throughout Europe. Religious conflict created new pressures for clothing that could communicate religious identity while avoiding the appearance of excessive worldliness. The result was a complex negotiation between spiritual values and social status that influenced fashion development for centuries. Protestant regions developed fashion traditions that emphasized simplicity, functionality, and moral restraint. The Puritan influence in England and the Netherlands led to the development of clothing that was well-made and expensive, but avoided obvious displays of luxury. Black became the dominant color for Protestant formal wear, not because it was cheap, but because it was sophisticated and morally appropriate. The plain style associated with Protestantism actually required very high levels of craftsmanship to achieve its deceptively simple effects. Catholic regions responded to Protestant criticism by developing even more elaborate and symbolic approaches to dress. The Counter-Reformation encouraged the use of clothing as a form of religious expression, leading to the development of fashion that incorporated religious symbols, biblical scenes, and devotional imagery. The elaborate vestments worn by Catholic clergy became models for secular fashion, while the emphasis on ritual and ceremony in Catholic regions encouraged the development of increasingly complex court dress. The religious wars of the 16th and 17th centuries created practical pressures for fashion innovation. Military influences began to appear in civilian dress, with doublets that resembled armor and accessories that reflected military rank and service. The need to identify friend from foe on the battlefield led to the development of distinctive national styles that would persist long after the wars ended. The Renaissance and Baroque periods saw remarkable technical innovations in fashion production that transformed how clothing was made and what was possible in terms of design and decoration. The development of new weaving techniques, the improvement of dyeing processes, and the invention of new tools for cutting and sewing all contributed to a revolution in fashion production that made possible the elaborate styles of the period. The invention of the spinning wheel and improvements in loom technology made possible the production of finer, more consistent fabrics. The development of new techniques for metallic thread production allowed for the creation of cloth of gold and silver that was both more durable and more brilliant than anything available in the medieval period. Advances in chemistry led to new dyeing techniques that could produce colors that were both more vibrant and more permanent. The period also saw the development of new approaches to pattern making and garment construction that made possible the fitted, tailored look that characterized Renaissance and Baroque fashion. The use of mathematical principles in pattern design, the development of new seaming techniques, and the invention of new fastening methods all contributed to the ability to create garments that were both fitted and flattering. The establishment of fashion guilds in major European cities created systems for training skilled artisans and maintaining quality standards. These guilds not only preserved traditional techniques but also encouraged innovation and experimentation. The guild system created a professional class of fashion artisans who could command high prices for their work and who were respected as skilled craftspeople rather than mere laborers. Women's fashion during the Renaissance and Baroque periods reflected the complex and often contradictory attitudes toward women's roles in society. On one hand, women's clothing became increasingly elaborate and decorative, reflecting the wealth and status of their families. On the other hand, the emphasis on constraint and control, embodied in garments like the corset, reflected deeper anxieties about women's place in society. The Renaissance saw the emergence of powerful women who used fashion as a tool of political influence. Catherine de' Medici, Elizabeth I of England, and Maria Theresa of Austria all understood that their clothing choices could communicate political messages and establish their authority in ways that transcended traditional gender roles. These women developed distinctive personal styles that became models for female fashion throughout Europe. The The Baroque period brought even more elaborate approaches to women's dress, with gowns that required multiple attendants to manage and that could cost more than a middle-class family's annual income. The fontange hairstyle, which could rise over a foot above the wearer's head, represented the pinnacle of artificial beauty. The wide panniers that extended women's skirts to enormous proportions created silhouettes that were both magnificent and impractical. The emphasis on elaborate women's fashion also created new economic opportunities for women. The fashion trades, millinery, dressmaking, and embroidery provided employment for thousands of women in major European cities. The skills required for these trades were highly valued, and successful businesswomen in the fashion industry could achieve considerable wealth and social status. Men's fashion, during the Renaissance and Baroque periods, underwent a transformation that reflected broader changes in masculine ideals and social structures. The medieval ideal of the warrior knight gave way to new concepts of the gentleman that emphasized cultural refinement, educational achievement, and social grace, alongside physical prowess. The Renaissance man was expected to be skilled in multiple areas: warfare, scholarship, the arts, and social interaction. This ideal was reflected in men's fashion, which became increasingly elaborate and decorative. The doublet and hose of the Renaissance period allowed for displays of wealth and sophistication that would have been inappropriate for medieval knights. The emphasis on fitted garments that revealed the body's natural proportions reflected new ideas about masculine beauty and physical perfection. The Baroque period brought even more elaborate approaches to men's dress. The long coats, elaborate wigs, and high heels that characterized Baroque masculine fashion created silhouettes that were both magnificent and artificial. The emphasis on decoration and display in men's fashion reflected the court culture of the period, where men were expected to compete in shows of elegance and refinement. The period also saw the development of new categories of men's clothing that reflected changing lifestyles and social roles. The emergence of urban professional classes created demand for clothing that was elegant but practical, leading to the development of new styles that would eventually evolve into modern business dress. The growth of international trade created new categories of clothing for travelers and merchants that emphasized durability and cultural adaptability. The Renaissance and Baroque periods saw the emergence of fashion as a major economic force that could influence international trade, urban development, and technological innovation. The luxury industries that developed around fashion production employed thousands of skilled artisans and generated enormous wealth for European cities. The silk industry in Lyon, France, became one of the most important manufacturing centers in Europe, producing fabrics that were exported throughout the continent and beyond. The lace industry in Brussels and Venice created products so valuable that they were used as currency in international trade. The jewelry industry in Paris and London developed new techniques for working with precious stones that made possible the elaborate decorative treatments that characterized Baroque fashion. The fashion industries also drove technological innovation in areas that extended far beyond clothing production. The development of new dyeing techniques contributed to advances in chemistry. The improvement of weaving technology led to innovations in mechanical engineering. The demand for precise measurements and consistent quality in fashion production contributed to the development of new approaches to manufacturing that would eventually influence industrial production in general. The economic importance of fashion also created new forms of international competition and cooperation. Fashion piracy became a serious problem as manufacturers in different countries attempted to copy successful designs. The development of trade guilds and professional organizations created systems for protecting intellectual property and maintaining quality standards. The emergence of fashion as a global industry created new forms of cultural exchange and economic interdependence. The Renaissance and Baroque periods saw fashion become a powerful tool for social mobility and status negotiation. The growth of merchant classes and the development of new forms of wealth created opportunities for individuals to use clothing to advance their social position and challenge traditional hierarchies. The emergence of new money created demand for clothing that could compete with traditional aristocratic dress. Wealthy merchants and successful professionals began commissioning garments that rivaled those worn by the nobility, leading to the development of sumptuary laws that attempted to regulate who could wear what. These laws were largely unsuccessful, as the economic power of the new classes made it impossible to enforce traditional dress codes. The fashion industries themselves created new opportunities for social advancement. Skilled artisans in the fashion trades could achieve considerable wealth and social status, particularly if they developed innovative techniques or established successful businesses. The international nature of the fashion trade created opportunities for talented individuals to travel and work in different countries, spreading skills and ideas across national boundaries. The period also saw the emergence of fashion as a form of cultural capital that could be used to gain access to elite social circles. Knowledge of current fashion trends, understanding of appropriate dress codes, and the ability to carry oneself well in fashionable clothing became important skills for anyone seeking to advance in society. This created new forms of social education and cultural transmission that extended far beyond the immediate world of fashion. As the Baroque period drew to a close in the early 18th century, fashion had been transformed from a relatively simple system of social signaling into a complex global industry that influenced politics, economics, and culture. The elaborate court dress of the Baroque period had created new standards of luxury and refinement that would influence fashion for centuries to come. The technical innovations of the period, improved weaving techniques, new dyeing processes, and advanced tailoring methods had created possibilities for clothing design that had never existed before. The global trade networks established during the colonial period had made available an unprecedented variety of materials and techniques. The emergence of fashion as a major economic force had created new forms of employment and new opportunities for social advancement. The social and cultural changes of the Renaissance and Baroque periods had also transformed how people thought about clothing and identity. Fashion had become a language for expressing individual personality, social status, and cultural values. The emphasis on personal appearance and sartorial sophistication had created new forms of social competition and cultural expression that would continue to evolve in the centuries to come. The stage was set for the next great transformation in fashion history. The Enlightenment would bring new ideas about reason, progress, and human nature that would challenge the elaborate artificiality of Baroque dress. The Industrial Revolution would create new possibilities for mass production and democratization of fashion. But the foundations laid during the Renaissance and Baroque periods, the technical skills, the global trade networks, and the cultural understanding of fashion as a form of personal and social expression would continue to influence how people dress and how societies organize themselves around the power of clothing. The story of Renaissance and Baroque fashion is ultimately a story of human ambition and creativity channeled through the transformation of the human body itself. From the geometric perfection of the corset to the elaborate artificiality of court dress, from the global reach of colonial trade to the technical innovations of skilled artisans, this period established fashion as one of the most powerful forces in human culture. The legacy of these centuries continues to influence how we think about beauty, power, and identity in the modern world. On the morning of October 14th, 1789, a crowd of Parisian women marched to Versailles, in what would become known as the Women's March. They wore simple woolen dresses, white aprons, and plain bonnets, the everyday clothing of working women. When they confronted Queen Marie Antoinette, resplendent in silk and jewels worth more than these women would earn in a lifetime, they were not just demanding bread. They were challenging the entire fashion system that had come to symbolize the grotesque inequality of the old regime. The Queen's elaborate gown, with its towering powdered hair and cascading panniers, represented everything these women despised about aristocratic privilege. In that moment, fashion became revolution, and revolution became fashion. The 18th century witnessed the most dramatic transformation in fashion since the invention of clothing itself. This was the age when fashion learned to speak the language of philosophy, when clothing became a battleground for competing ideas about human nature, social organization, and political legitimacy. From the refined elegance of Rococo court dress to the deliberate simplicity of revolutionary fashion, the 18th century saw clothing evolve from mere decoration into a powerful tool of social and political change. The 18th century began with fashion, reaching unprecedented heights of artistic refinement. The Rococo movement, emerging from the French court of Louis XV, created an aesthetic that valued delicacy, grace, and sophisticated pleasure over the grand formality of the Baroque period. Rococo fashion was characterized by its emphasis on pastel colors, flowing lines, and intricate decorative details that seemed to float weightlessly across the surface of garments. The influence of Madame de Pompadour, the official mistress of Louis XV, cannot be overstated in understanding Rococo fashion. A woman of exceptional taste and intelligence, Pompadour understood that fashion could be a form of cultural leadership. She commissioned garments that were masterpieces of textile art, collaborating with the finest silk designers in Lyon to create fabrics that incorporated everything from naturalistic floral motifs to complex allegorical scenes. Her influence extended beyond French borders as European courts scrambled to imitate the Pompadour style. Rococo fashion was distinguished by its celebration of femininity and sensuality. Women's gowns featured necklines that revealed the décolletage, waists that were compressed to impossible proportions, and skirts that extended horizontally through the use of side panniers. The overall effect was to create a silhouette that was both artificial and seductive, emphasizing the wearer's status as an object of aesthetic contemplation. The elaborate hairstyles of the period, often rising 18 inches or more above the head, were architectural marvels that required the services of professional hairdressers and could take hours to construct. The decorative arts reached new heights during the Rococo period, with fashion serving as a canvas for the finest craftsmanship Europe could produce. Embroidery became increasingly sophisticated, incorporating silk threads, metallic accents, and even precious stones in patterns that could take months to complete. Lace-making reached levels of technical perfection that have never been surpassed, with individual pieces requiring years of work by skilled artisans. The fans, jewelry, and accessories that completed Rococo ensembles were works of art in their own right, often created by the same craftsmen who produced fine furniture and decorative objects for aristocratic homes. As the century progressed, Enlightenment philosophers began to challenge the elaborate artificiality of Rococo fashion. Thinkers like Voltaire, Rousseau, and Diderot argued that excessive ornamentation in dress represented a corruption of natural simplicity and moral virtue. Rousseau, in particular, advocated for a return to natural styles that would allow the human form to appear as nature intended, free from the distortions imposed by corsets, panniers, and elaborate decorative treatments. The Enlightenment critique of fashion was part of a broader philosophical movement that questioned traditional authorities and sought to establish new forms of social organization based on reason rather than tradition. Fashion reformers argued that the time and resources devoted to elaborate dress could be better spent on education, scientific research, and social improvement. They pointed to the contrast between aristocratic luxury and popular poverty as evidence of the moral bankruptcy of the old regime. This philosophical challenge to traditional fashion found expression in the development of new styles that emphasized simplicity, functionality, and moral virtue. The English country dress, characterized by its practical cut and muted colors, became a symbol of Enlightenment values. The robe à l'anglaise, a looser-fitting gown that allowed for greater freedom of movement, was adopted by fashionable women who wanted to signal their adherence to progressive ideas without completely abandoning stylish dress. The influence of Enlightenment thinking on fashion was particularly evident in the development of children's clothing. Rousseau's educational theories emphasized the importance of allowing children to develop naturally, free from adult constraints and artificial restrictions. This led to the creation of children's clothing that was simpler, more comfortable, and more appropriate to the activities of childhood. The elaborate miniature court dress that had previously been imposed on children was gradually replaced by clothing that recognized childhood as a distinct stage of human development. While France remained the center of high fashion throughout the 18th century, Britain developed its own distinctive approach to dress that reflected the country's emerging industrial power and different social values. British fashion was characterized by its emphasis on quality craftsmanship, understated elegance, and practical functionality. The rise of British textile manufacturing, particularly in wool production, created new possibilities for clothing that was both stylish and durable. The development of British men's fashion was particularly significant. The three-piece suit, consisting of coat, waistcoat, and breeches, emerged as the standard form of masculine dress and would remain so for centuries to come. This style was distinguished by its emphasis on fit, proportion, and subtle details rather than obvious decoration. The finest British tailors, concentrated on London's Savile Row, developed techniques for cutting and fitting garments that were unsurpassed anywhere in the world. British women's fashion also developed its own character, influenced by the country's Protestant traditions and growing middle-class prosperity. British women's dress was generally less elaborate than French court fashion, but emphasized quality materials and excellent construction. The development of British cotton printing, particularly in Manchester and other industrial centers, created new possibilities for fashionable dress that was both beautiful and affordable. The influence of British fashion extended throughout the British Empire, creating a global network of style that competed with French fashion leadership. British colonial administrators, merchants, and settlers carried British fashion traditions to India, North America, and the Caribbean, where they were adapted to local climates and conditions. The result was the development of distinctive colonial fashion traditions that combined British style with local materials and techniques. Fashion in colonial America represented a fascinating synthesis of European traditions and New World conditions. American colonists were eager to maintain connections with European fashion, ordering the latest styles from London and Paris through an elaborate network of merchants and factors. However, the practical demands of colonial life and the limited availability of luxury materials created unique adaptations that would eventually contribute to distinctly American fashion traditions. The Puritan influence in New England created fashion traditions that emphasized simplicity, functionality, and moral restraint. Puritan dress codes prohibited excessive ornamentation and regulated the types of fabrics and colors that could be worn by different social classes. However, this apparent simplicity often masked considerable sophistication in cut, construction, and material quality. The finest Puritan clothing was expensive and well-made. representing a form of conspicuous consumption that expressed wealth through understatement rather than obvious display. In the southern colonies, where plantation agriculture created enormous wealth for the planter class, fashion followed European models more closely. Virginia and South Carolina planters commissioned elaborate clothing from London tailors and competed with each other in displays of sartorial magnificence. The plantation system also created distinctive forms of clothing for enslaved workers, whose dress was regulated by laws that prohibited them from wearing certain materials or colors that might suggest higher social status. The mid-18th century saw the emergence of distinctly American fashion innovations, particularly in the development of practical clothing adapted to frontier conditions. The hunting shirt, a loose-fitting garment that provided freedom of movement and protection from the elements, became a symbol of American independence and self-reliance. Similarly, American women developed new approaches to dress that emphasized practicality and durability while maintaining standards of respectability and fashion consciousness. The 18th century witnessed what historians call the Consumer Revolution, a fundamental transformation in how goods were produced, distributed, and consumed. Fashion played a central role in this revolution, as the desire for stylish clothing drove innovations in manufacturing, marketing, and retail distribution that would lay the foundations for the modern consumer economy. The development of fashion magazines, beginning with publications like the Ladies' Magazine in London, created new ways of disseminating style information and creating demand for fashionable goods. These publications featured detailed descriptions of the latest fashions, often accompanied by hand-colored illustrations that allowed readers to see exactly what was being worn in the fashionable world. The magazines also included practical advice on how to modify existing garments to follow new trends, democratizing fashion in ways that had never been possible before. The growth of retail establishments specifically devoted to fashion represented another important innovation. Shops like Harding, Howell, and Company in London offered a new form of shopping experience that emphasized browsing, comparison, and impulse buying. These early department stores created elaborate window displays and hired skilled salespeople who could advise customers on the latest trends and help them coordinate complete ensembles. The development of ready-made clothing, particularly for men, began to challenge the traditional system of bespoke tailoring. Enterprising merchants recognized that many garments could be produced in standard sizes and sold at lower prices than custom-made clothing. This innovation was particularly important in colonial markets, where the absence of skilled tailors made ready-made clothing an attractive option for middle-class consumers. The 18th century saw remarkable technical innovations in textile production and garment construction that made possible the elaborate fashions of the period. The development of new weaving techniques, improvements in dyeing processes, and innovations in garment cutting and fitting all contributed to the ability to create clothing that was both more beautiful and more comfortable than ever before. The silk industry reached new heights of technical sophistication during this period. The workshops of Lyon developed new techniques for creating fabrics that incorporated multiple colors, complex patterns, and even pictorial scenes. The invention of the draw loom made possible the production of fabrics with repeating patterns that could be precisely controlled and reproduced. These technical innovations made silk fabrics more varied and beautiful, while also reducing their cost and making them accessible to a broader range of consumers. Cotton production was revolutionized by innovations in both cultivation and processing. The development of new cotton varieties that could be grown in different climates expanded the geographical range of cotton production. Improvements in spinning and weaving technology made it possible to produce cotton fabrics that were finer, stronger, and more consistent than ever before. The invention of new printing techniques made possible the production of cotton fabrics with complex patterns and bright colors that rivaled the finest silk textiles. The development of new approaches to garment cutting and construction made possible the fitted silhouettes that characterized 18th century fashion. Pattern making became more scientific, with the development of systematic approaches to creating templates that could ensure proper fit and proportion. New seaming techniques made it possible to create garments that followed the contours of the body more closely, while still allowing for freedom of movement. Women's fashion in the 18th century embodied the contradictions of women's position in society during this period. On one hand, fashion provided women with opportunities for self-expression, creativity, and even economic independence. On the other hand, the elaborate and restrictive nature of much women's clothing reinforced traditional ideas about feminine roles and capabilities. The role of women as fashion leaders became increasingly important during this period. Aristocratic women like the Duchess of Devonshire in England and the Duchesse de Polignac in France became international fashion icons whose style choices were closely watched and widely imitated. These women understood that fashion could be a form of power, allowing them to influence culture and society in ways that were otherwise restricted to men. The development of women's fashion trades provided economic opportunities for thousands of women in major European and American cities. Mantua makers, milliners, and embroiderers could achieve considerable prosperity and social status through their skills. The fashion trades also provided one of the few paths to business ownership for women, as successful dressmakers and milliners often established their own shops and employed other women. However, the physical constraints imposed by 18th century women's fashion were more severe than in any previous period. The tight-laced stays that compressed the torso, the enormous panniers that extended the hips, and the towering hairstyles that required constant maintenance all limited women's physical freedom and reinforced ideas about feminine fragility and dependence. The time and expense required to maintain fashionable appearance also restricted women's ability to engage in other activities. Men's fashion in the 18th century underwent a gradual democratization that reflected broader social and political changes. The elaborate court dress of the early 18th century, with its emphasis on silk fabrics, bright colors, and decorative ornamentation, gradually gave way to simpler styles that emphasized quality materials and expert tailoring over obvious display. The development of the modern business suit can be traced to innovations in men's fashion during this period. The three-piece suit of coat, waistcoat, and breeches provided a versatile foundation that could be dressed up or down depending on the occasion. The emphasis on fit and proportion rather than decoration made this style accessible to middle-class men who could afford quality tailoring but not elaborate ornamentation. The influence of military fashion on civilian dress became increasingly important as the century progressed. The clean lines and functional details of military uniforms appealed to men who wanted to appear both fashionable and masculine. The adoption of military-inspired details like brass buttons, braided trim, and structured shoulders created a more masculine aesthetic that would influence men's fashion for centuries to come. The growing importance of professional and commercial activities also influenced men's fashion. The development of clothing appropriate for office work, travel, and business meetings created new categories of men's dress that emphasized practicality and respectability. The emergence of distinct categories like morning dress, afternoon dress, and evening dress reflected the increasingly complex social lives of urban professional men. The political upheavals of the late 18th century transformed fashion from a marker of social status into a tool of political expression. The American Revolution created new symbols of Republican virtue that challenged traditional aristocratic fashion. The French Revolution went even further. attempting to completely overthrow the existing fashion system and replace it with new forms of dress that would reflect revolutionary values. In America, the boycott of British goods during the pre-revolutionary period made fashion a form of political protest. American women organized spinning bees and wearing parties where they displayed clothing made from domestic materials as a statement of political independence. The adoption of simpler, more practical styles became a way of expressing American values and rejecting British luxury and corruption. The French Revolution represented the most dramatic challenge to traditional fashion in European history. Revolutionary leaders attempted to create entirely new forms of dress that would reflect the principles of liberty, equality, and fraternity. The elaborate court dress of the old regime was rejected as a symbol of aristocratic privilege and corruption. Instead, revolutionaries promoted simple styles that emphasized the natural equality of all citizens. The symbolic transformation of fashion during the French Revolution was remarkably rapid and comprehensive. The powdered wigs that had been mandatory for respectable men were abandoned almost overnight. Women's dress became simpler and more natural, with the elaborate panniers and tight stays of the old regime replaced by flowing gowns inspired by classical antiquity. The color symbolism of revolutionary fashion was particularly important, with the tricolor cockade becoming a mandatory symbol of political loyalty. The 18th century saw fashion become truly global for the first time, as European colonial expansion and trade networks connected fashion systems around the world. The influence flowed in multiple directions, with European fashions spreading to colonial territories, while exotic materials and techniques from around the world influenced European dress. The China trade brought new materials and aesthetic influences to European fashion. Chinese silk continued to be highly prized, but European consumers also developed a taste for Chinese porcelain accessories, lacquered items, and decorative motifs that influenced textile design. The fashion for chinoiserie created a hybrid aesthetic that combined European and Chinese elements in novel ways. The Indian textile trade had an even more profound impact on European fashion. Indian cotton textiles, particularly the painted and printed fabrics known as chintz, became enormously popular in Europe. The bright colors and exotic patterns of Indian textiles influenced European textile design and led to the development of new printing techniques that could reproduce similar effects using European materials and methods. The African trade, largely conducted through the horrific system of slavery, also influenced 18th century fashion. African materials like ivory and exotic feathers became prized luxury items, while the cotton, produced by enslaved labor in the American colonies, provided the raw material for much European textile production. The profits from the slave trade funded much of the luxury consumption that characterized 18th century aristocratic fashion. The 18th century saw the emergence of fashion criticism as a distinct literary genre. Writers began to analyze fashion not just as a matter of personal taste, but as a reflection of broader social, political, and cultural trends. This critical discourse helped establish fashion as a legitimate subject for intellectual analysis and contributed to the development of more sophisticated understanding of clothing's role in society. Publications like The Spectator in England and various French journals began to feature regular commentary on fashion trends and their social implications. These publications helped create a more informed fashion public and contributed to the rapid dissemination of style information across national boundaries. The development of fashion criticism also created new career opportunities for writers and intellectuals who could make a living by observing and commenting on social trends. The emergence of fashion theory during this period was closely connected to broader philosophical developments. Enlightenment thinkers began to analyze fashion as a social phenomenon that could reveal important truths about human nature and social organization. This analytical approach to fashion laid the groundwork for more systematic study of clothing and its cultural significance. By the end of the 18th century, fashion had become one of Europe's most important industries, employing hundreds of thousands of workers and generating enormous wealth. The textile industries of Britain, France, and other European countries had become sophisticated manufacturing systems that could produce high-quality goods for both domestic and international markets. The fashion industry also drove innovation in other sectors of the economy. The demand for fashion goods created markets for everything from raw materials to transportation services. The need for credit to finance fashion purchases led to the development of new financial instruments and banking services. The seasonal nature of fashion demand created new approaches to inventory management and marketing that would influence business practices in other industries. The global reach of the 18th century fashion industry also created new forms of economic dependency and exploitation. The colonial system that supplied raw materials for European fashion production was based on forced labor and environmental destruction that would have lasting consequences. The wealth that funded aristocratic fashion consumption was often extracted from colonial territories through violence and exploitation. As the 18th century drew to a close, fashion had been transformed from a relatively simple system of social signaling into a complex cultural phenomenon that influenced politics, economics, philosophy, and art. The innovations of this period, the development of fashion magazines, the emergence of ready-made clothing, the establishment of retail fashion establishments, and the creation of fashion criticism, laid the foundations for the modern fashion industry. The political upheavals of the late 18th century demonstrated fashion's power as a tool of social and political change. The ability of clothing to communicate complex messages about identity, values, and aspirations had been conclusively demonstrated. The revolutionary potential of fashion, its ability to challenge existing power structures and create new forms of social organization, had been revealed. The technical innovations of the 18th century, improvements in textile production, new approaches to garment construction, and the development of more efficient distribution systems created possibilities for fashion development that would be fully realized in the industrial age. The global trade networks established during this period created the foundation for the international fashion system that would emerge in the 19th century. The 18th century established fashion as one of the most powerful forces in modern culture. The period's combination of artistic refinement, technical innovation, political engagement, and global reach created a fashion system that was both more sophisticated and more democratic than anything that had existed before. The legacy of 18th century fashion continues to influence how we think about clothing, identity, and social change in the modern world. We've reached the end of the first part of our documentary. The second and final part will be released within a week. Enjoy watching.